Well, welcome everyone to this morning's webinar, or this morning or this afternoon's webinar, depending on where you are. I am Charlene Sun-Rigby. I am the CEO of Global Genes, and we are very excited to bring this webinar to you with our partner admedicum. So a little bit on our partnership. This was announced last fall, and we are bringing together admedicum's capabilities as a firm with significant experience in patient insights research. And this is throughout the therapy development and market access lifecycle. And we're bringing admedicum together with our organization, Global Genes. We are a patient advocacy organization that works across rare diseases. And we have a research and data platform called RareX. Both of our organizations are dedicated to giving patients an active voice in research, in data generation, and really driving collaboration across healthcare stakeholders. And we are really aiming with this collaboration to amplify the patient voice and key insights that will accelerate and improve therapy development. So today we're going to talk about why caregiver-reported symptoms matter in rare pediatric disorders. And so why did we choose this topic? Caregiver-reported data, especially in rare pediatric disorders, and we're going to focus here on pediatric neurodevelopmental disorders, is really essential. It provides very important and actionable insights that can address key evidence gaps. These insights can improve disease understanding, support refining of outcome measures, and enable generation of patient-centered evidence that supports regulatory interactions, HTA, and access discussions. And so today we're going to cover how RareX data, together with human expert-led patient engagement, enables the development of these types of insights. And so if you can go to the next slide, I'd like to introduce our speakers. So today we have Carmen Supek from Global Genes. She is the Senior Director of Scientific Programs and is responsible for developing collaborative programs and partnerships that maximize the power of patient-owned data to advance rare disease understanding and support treatment development. Carmen's background is she is a trained clinical genetic counselor who has dedicated her career to supporting patients and families impacted by rare disease and to partner with rare disease communities as critical stakeholders in the advancement of clinical and therapeutic research. And her work has spanned academic care, clinical research, telemedicine, as well as nonprofit advocacy. At Global Genes, Carmen works side by side with patient advocacy and biopharma partners to develop and implement research strategies and programs that utilize a variety of methodologies, including the RareX platform. And I'm also delighted to introduce Dr. Andreas Reimann, who brings extensive senior level expertise across pricing and reimbursement, patient representation, rare diseases, and clinical development. He is a pharmacist by training and also holds an MBA. Dr. Reimann serves as a patient representative at Germany's Federal Joint Committee, the GBA, and has been involved in the preparation of numerous regulatory and health economic dossiers from the patient perspective. Over the course of his career, he has built trusted and deep relationships with patient organizations in Germany and across Europe, as well as with German public and private payers. He spent 12 years as the CEO of the German Cystic Fibrosis Association, and there really established himself as a patient-side expert in rare respiratory diseases. And he also spent 9 years as managing director of Mucosidosis Institute. I wanted to say it in English. GmbH, the clinical development and quality management affiliate of the association, where he gained substantial experience in respiratory disease clinical trials. His leadership also extends across the wider rare disease landscape, including 6 years as a member of the board of Eurodis and 13 years as senior vice president and later president of the German Alliance for Rare Diseases. Furthermore, Andreas has a deep understanding of disruptive changes driven by connected health, particularly the evolving roles of patients and digital technology in shaping the future of healthcare. And with that, I will pass things over to our speakers.
Yeah, thank you very much, Charlene, for that very insightful introduction, and welcome everybody from my side as well. This is our agenda. We start first why caregiver-reported symptoms matter in rare pediatric disorders. Then we will talk about a couple of case studies, exactly showing caregiver insights, how caregiver insights shape evidence. We will talk about the meaning for regulatory and HTA decision making, present our integrated evidence model and its practical implications for development and access. And then we wrap up with take-home messages and discussions. And just to remind you, please, if you have questions in the meantime, feel free to key them in the chat, and we will then address them at the end of the presentations. Now, in rare diseases, of course, we have a limited number of patients and very fragmented data. That's really widespread knowledge. We have also an incomplete understanding of the lived experience and the disease burden in many cases. So the outcomes and the endpoints are therefore not always aligned with what matters to patients. And we have, on the other hand side, growing expectations from regulators, HTA bodies, and payers that data is presented that is meeting what matters to patients. So how to address this? Data is not enough, but context matters. Caregivers in pediatric diseases can provide a unique understanding because they are living, of course, daily with the patients, with the children. They see how the disease impacts them, and they can contribute to meaningful clinical outcome measures. And lack of caregiver data risk incomplete clinical strategies and misaligned product profiles. And this is also important for regulatory recognition. Agencies recognize all over the world, on both sides of the ponds, actually, caregiver-reported data is vital to ensuring relevant and meaningful evidence. Importance of patients and caregiver data is increasingly recognized by the agencies, by both FDA and EMA, and they emphasize in their guidelines that this should be presented and outcome parameter selection should be carefully based on what matters to patients. And after regulation, after marketing authorization, of course, the HTA bodies looking to the added benefit of a medicinal product need real world impact, and like the caregiver workload, for instance, and the quality of life to justify reimbursement decisions. So to summarize, missing signals at the start of the development may just lead to a flawed development strategy. If you need to correct your course of development, that requires early insights, and that goes without saying. If you do it too late, you will miss important milestones. So there is a value of proactive identification of caregiver-reported insights, and how to do that we will cover in a couple of minutes. So when we talk about a disease concept model, in a very generic way, we have to see that the physical, cognitive, and emotional symptoms and impact on life of the course of the disease are one very important aspect, as well as the diagnostic pathway and the experience of receiving the diagnosis. But also treatment options and experiences, the involvement in patient advocacy, the communication with healthcare professionals, and the financial impact, the impact on working life, the attitudes towards living with the disease, unmet medical needs, and the impact on family planning have to be figured in. And with that, I hand over to Carmen, who will lead us through the case studies.
Great. Thank you so much, Andreas. So we're going to talk a little bit about some case studies that each of our organizations has led, and then talk about kind of how we foresee some of that work being done together. So I'll talk first about some work that we did to really elicit caregiver-reported symptoms and impacts, and understand how the caregiver experience really adds to what's already known. We'll talk about some burden of illness studies and how that really helps to shape and define study design, and then talk about the impact of that to the whole family. And then finally talk about PRO validation and development. So what happens when a measure is not quite right or a measure doesn't exist to really capture the symptoms that are most critical to the patient population. Okay, you can move on. Great. So here at Global Genes, as Charlene mentioned, we have a data platform called RareX, and essentially that is a very robust research-grade registry. We partner with patient advocacy organizations to do outreach in their communities and collect data globally, and that data is primarily patient-reported or caregiver-reported. And we recognized that we were starting to identify many symptoms that were sometimes not only present, but even prevalent in some rare diseases that are represented on our platform that are really not well recognized in the existing medical literature. And with that observation, we actually conducted an open science data challenge. So think of this as a long form hackathon. And what we did is we included data across 27 different ultra rare neurologic diseases. So these are pediatric neurodevelopmental disorders. They're distinct conditions, but with some overlapping symptoms. And we also collect data in a very systematic way so that that data really could be compared across disorders. And through this challenge, we had more than 1,700 affected participants in this across with data from 64 countries. And I just provided one example here. So this is Milan syndrome, and you can see that the sort of teal bars represent the symptoms that were previously known and recognized through the medical literature. And those that are in this sort of maize color, this dark yellow color, are those that were either completely unrecognized or really significantly underrepresented and underappreciated in the literature and in public databases. And across the 27 disorders that we studied through this challenge, this turned out to be true in every single one of them. In every single disease, there was at least one symptom that was recognized. And what this really highlights is that there is a difference in what symptoms you can really understand and appreciate when you talk deeply to caregivers versus when you look at the medical literature and you look at the EMR, the electronic medical record. So there's just a difference in what comes from a very medical perspective in the way that clinicians tend to ask questions and collect data versus when you ask caregivers to talk about the symptoms and their experience with the condition. Sorry, in every single one we found at least one, but they weren't always like in this top section. So that's what over on the right, it says for 85% of rare diseases, it was like in 85%, they were really significant symptoms. And these were the most common ones that we found. Commonly reported symptoms that were not previously recognized included sleep disturbances, behavioral difficulties, and reduced vision, which came from a variety of underlying causes. In this particular group, most commonly from cortical visual impairment. Next slide. Great. So we've done a number of different types of burden of illness studies. So in burden of illness studies, we really want to capture not necessarily what are the most frequent, most common symptoms, but what are the symptoms and the daily impacts to life that are most critical to the patient and to the family. And from a methodology perspective, it is actually important to capture those separately. And so we always do, because you don't want to conflate those for families. You really want to separate those out and make sure that families are thinking about like, what do they perceive as really being most burdensome to their child versus what is burdensome to the family or to the caregiver. And I think that example of sleep is the one that I always think about for this, right? Because like when my children were little, a 3-year-old doesn't care if they're up for a couple of hours playing in the middle of the night, but as a parent, you sure do. So in our studies, we always collect that separately and make sure that we're being very clear in our methodology and what we're asking. So what you can see here, this is one example that we've done in a condition called Wiedemann-Steiner syndrome. This is a neurodevelopmental disorder. And what you see is that the symptoms in this condition that are most impactful, that really create burden, are these disruptive and aggressive behaviors. So lots of behavioral issues, digestive system issues, intellectual disability, feeding difficulties. And those don't necessarily align to the most common symptoms. So this happens frequently when we do these kind of studies, that you find that the list is differently ordered, and that's really important when you think about what are the right endpoints. What should we be measuring in a clinical trial? We want to make sure that what we're measuring is what's really important to the family. Okay, next slide. And so this is the same case study, the same example. And I think what's really important here, so the last slide I showed you symptoms. These are activities of daily living. And so we always separate these out too and really talk about like what are the day-to-day activities that for this child, for the family, are impacted. And so here you can see that the top 3 reported in this patient community are toileting, self-care, so this is bathing, dressing, and then as children get older and transition to adulthood, independent living. These are all related to independence. So, in some neurodevelopmental conditions, most of the children are not going to probably be able to live independently when they reach adulthood, but in some they will. And so it's really, really important to recognize, when that is and just how critical that is to families. That cannot be underestimated. And so we have to really think hard about how do we measure these as meaningful endpoints. Okay, next slide. So this is a different condition that we more recently worked on. And the reason I wanted to show you this is that sometimes in an ultra rare disease, you don't get 50 or 75 people who you can include in your study, as we did in the last one. Like I showed you, I think our last data poll for that particular project was 45 individuals, but now it's significantly higher than that. Here, we're talking about 7 patients. This is an ultra rare disease. And so it's important to remember that we can still do these kinds of studies in ultra rare diseases, but it's important to use a mixed methods approach. So in this particular community, we started with a literature review to form hypotheses. Then we did deep dive interviews in the patient community and with caregivers in the community. Then we pulled them together into an advisory panel to talk through kind of what are the insights that came out of those interviews and the literature review, and then had them kind of discuss and decide together how they would really weight the most impactful symptoms, and then followed up with a survey, which is what creates the actual data that you see here. And on the left, what you can see is that in the initial literature review and even the initial caregiver interviews, digestive system issues did not come up. But then when we discussed it in the advisory panel, they realized, like, wait, how did we miss that? And we didn't do deep dive interviews with all seven. We did them with four. So part of it is just who did we miss, right? But part of it is just like this mixed methods approach of going back and forth and really making sure that this resonates with the community that you're serving. And then at the very end, there was one that came up multiple times in the literature review of low bone density, and in discussions with the caregivers, they said, like, this is just, there's so many issues that we're dealing with. This is really not an issue for us at all. Like, if I were, I think you should drop it. And then in this same community, we also talked about, like, the impact. There is significant impact to the caregivers and to the family overall in many of these conditions. And in this particular community, home finances and the caregiver's ability to hold down a job were the number one impact that caregivers reported to them and to their family. Communication with their child was the second. Communication with affected children is probably across neurodevelopmental disorders the thing that comes up the most. People want to be able to communicate better with their children, and that doesn't that's not exclusive to kind of one end of the spectrum or the other. If you have a child who's completely nonverbal, we need to still have ways to measure very discreetly how they're communicating and know that we can measure change because they're still communicating. And then at the other end, when we have children who are verbal but may have kind of deficits in their full expression of what they're feeling, like, that's still often very important to families to just improve that level of communication. Okay, in the interest of time, next slide.
Yeah, thanks very much, Carmen, for these case studies, which really nicely depict how important it is and how also possible it is to identify symptoms that have not yet been recognized in clinical trials. And this is a case study in a ultra-rare disease. Actually, XTXPB1 is a genetic developmental disorder that leads to seizures in early childhood. And with the help of global genes, we could do a mixed methods study, both qualitative and then quantitatively, in a total of 229 families. And just to say how impressive that is, we have in total about 1,300 worldwide known patients. So that's really a big representation of that disease. And you see in the upper right hand corner the represent the where the participants came from, mainly from the US and European countries, and including Italy, Spain, UK, Germany. And the children's age and the gender. And they the patients in their qualitative part, the caregivers reported the patient journey actually very detailed, which allows to understand at what point in time of that patient journey what the kind of symptoms and the burden of disease is most prominent. Of course, it's a very difficult condition for the families, but we could identify also subsets of patients that are with a later onset, and some patients with no seizures at all, which is also important for companies, for instance, who wish to address those that disease. This is another example in a neuromuscular disease, rare neuromuscular disease. Uh, when we did both qualitative and quantitative studies here, caregivers reported that initiating movement, for instance, fine motor task and fatigue, and physical activity, balance and safety were really important aspects that have not been yet well recognized in clinical trials, where normally only a 6 minutes walking test has been, so a performance-based activity actually has been used as a primary outcome measure. Um, Cold days were the worst. These hands would not just lock up. I always had to sit out of games because I knew I couldn't keep up. These are reports from patients and caregivers, which very concretely depict how much their disease is affecting daily life. And this is a example how EMA, in this case, the COMP, the Committee of Orphan Medicinal Products, which is the committee governing the orphan drug status in the European system, recognized a survey which we did in Europe in 18 European countries with 390 myotonia patients. And this is open. This is so to say open labelly, open source. This is a case study which involved a product by Lupin Neurosciences, and we are allowed to share that information. And at that time of the of marketing authorization application, the COMP had to review whether the orphan drug designation can still be maintained. And at that time, COMP doubted whether this is necessary because they said the product may be available already in some European countries due to special hospital homemade production, so to say, in-house production. And we could depict that in 17 out of 18 European countries, there was a big excess issue. And so, based on that and on the severity of the disease and on the clinical data, of course, COMP maintained the orphan drug designation, and CHMP, so the Committee of Human Medicinal Products, which basically provides the scientific opinion, provided a positive opinion to register that product. So, as a kind of summary, um, if you have identified novel outcomes, of course, you need to justify why this is something that needs to be included in and it should be addressed in clinical development. Otherwise, that can't be accepted. You need to stress caregiver insights can establish the validity of their data, especially in the pediatric context. Um, Regulatory agencies are quite open actually to discuss this if you can provide evidence that new outcome parameters can help to improve both regulatory decisions as later on HTA decisions. So incorporating caregiver insight makes novel outcomes credible components of efficacy and value evaluations. And with that, Carmen.
Great, thank you. So We also wanted to talk a little bit, and Andreas just kind of led into this very nicely, talking about outcome measures and the development and validation of patient-reported outcome measures. So here's an example of a study that we're currently working on in disorders of hypersomnolence, so faint narcolepsy and related disorders. And in this condition, in this group of conditions, primarily narcolepsy and idiopathic hypersomnia, what we know from insights from the patient communities is that brain fog is the number one most burdensome symptom that is reported by the community. But in clinical trials to date, it's never been meaningfully measured. It has been felt to be sort of too difficult to really truly measure and capture. But the voice of the patient community has been so strong and so consistent on this point that biopharma companies are realizing, like, we need to change this. We need to measure this and understand how therapies are addressing this brain fog. And so we have this kind of three-part study that we're doing in collaboration with the patient community. The first one was to design a study to really measure this patient experience. So through this, we pulled together an expert working group and developed a consensus. And this expert working group was a multidisciplinary group composed of clinicians and researchers from industry and patient advocates all across these disorders. And so with that, we got this consensus on what are the patient-reported outcomes that exist today that are really useful to use in this patient community. But what they all agreed is that, yep, sure enough, like, brain fog is so critical, but none of the current PROs really fully capture this experience. So, we did like a deep literature review, discussion with all of these experts globally. And this was the consensus, is that we need to do better. We don't have one that does this very well. And so now what we're doing is working on kind of defining how we get to that better measure. So first we did some focus groups and got some individual input from the patient community on what's missing. So we know that the ones that exist aren't ideal, but what's not ideal about them? What's missing? And then, oops, can we go back? Thank you. And then we're distributing, so it says we are here, so that's where I'm talking now. So we are currently distributing the 3 existing measures that the expert group told us are sort of a reasonable place to start. And so we're distributing those to the patient community. We have a goal of getting a couple hundred responses on that this year. We're well on our way, and getting feedback on specific areas of fit and need. So what components of the existing measures are working and what aren't, and what needs to be created. And then we will develop a new measure and again elicit feedback from this same patient community as part of that validation process. Okay, you can move forward. And so I think from what Andreas showed, you could already see that we are both quite committed. Both of our groups are really committed to ensuring that the data that we're collecting is really robust and suited for publication. And here's an example of that. So in that first stage of this project that I talked about, where we got consensus on patient-reported outcome measures and the need for better measures for brain fog, this was just recently published in Sleep Advances, which is a very well-known publication in this area for these conditions. Okay, next slide. And am I handing it back to you, Andreas? I'm sorry, I forgot. Or do you want me to keep going?
No problem at all. Actually, this is so we have what we believe a one integrated evidence model. Both parties Global Genes and Admedicum jointly deliver an end-to-end rare disease evidence solution by uniting structured research-grade digital data based on the RareX database and human-led patient engagement and co-creation, which we do as admedicum, and we think that combination makes the value of that alliance really strong and robust. And what we need is to engage with patient communities to provide the structured data collection by rare disease, by RareX, to have a human-led insight generation and contextualization, which is important, to have an integrated analysis and interpretation of qualitative and quantitative and data. So we will get insight-rich outputs that help to steer the development. And here is another nice example from Global Genes. Carmen.
Yeah, this is an example that just really highlights kind of the base purpose of the RareX registry and database. So this is a condition that is really like, there are a number of conditions on our platform that could have a very similar slide to this one. So in 2010, FOXP1 syndrome was first described. And there were just 4 children identified in that initial report. And then over the course of the next 10 years, there was a series of case reports and retrospective studies that were done and published, totaling 62 patients. So, that's hard, long work to find these rare disease patients and get them evaluated within just a couple of clinical centers. The global community that we now have robust data from is almost 300 patients. So over the course of the next 4 years, the community really, so we provide the technology, we provide the technical support, but the community is really pulling together on the importance of this initiative and getting individuals with this condition globally, creating partnerships with related patient advocacy organizations in different countries around the world, in ways that we can collect data that really reflect, especially this caregiver-reported patient experience data on all kinds of individuals who would not be able to travel to that single or to 2 clinical research sites. Next slide. And here's one example. There are many, but here's one example that I pulled out that I think is really important about what we're learning from this community. We have this whole series of patient data that comes from individuals who are over the age of 20. And in most clinical research studies at academic medical centers, the vast majority of the data comes from pediatric patients. And this is so critical to capture and to learn from. It's critical for families to know what is the long-term outcome. What does that look like for my child? Like, what can I expect? What can I hope for? What do we need to be mindful of and ask our doctor to help look out for? But also, when we think about clinical trials, we need to think about therapeutic window. And therapeutic window doesn't just mean, well, this is a neurodevelopmental disorder, and so, the therapeutic window is really even before birth or very early childhood. That's a very simplistic way to look at it that really doesn't recognize how many therapeutic opportunities there often are for these conditions. And when we understand what happens to adults with these conditions, and we see things like, well, in some neurodevelopmental conditions, you see catatonia occur sometimes in young adults. And that's very under-recognized in the medical community at large. And so empowering patients and families to know what that looks like and how to look out for it is important. But it's also important as a potential therapeutic window. What if you could fully prevent that from happening? And there are many other examples. Excellent. Okay, very good.
So, to support decisions across the life cycle of a medicinal product and across the developmental cycle, it is first important to understand really the disease and to model a concept around it. When, at what time, to what extent, and with what kind of symptoms is that disease actually affecting families? This helps driving outcome and endpoint refinement. You may look to the guidance that is available or to the precedence that is available, or probably there is no precedence at all because it's the first of its kind in that therapeutic area. Then the insights help drive and shape the endpoint refinement. Of course, they need to be validated and properly. It needs to be shown that they really provide valid insights. It is then important to identify and pre-screen the patients to conduct to develop and to conduct the clinical development and to present it to the regulatory and HTA agencies. So at all these steps, RareX and admedicum can help to add value, significant value to all of these steps. But to be honest and to be fair, time is of essence. If you look to the patient-relevant evidence base on the y-axis and the time on the x-axis, you have certain points, of course, where you can create that patient-relevant data mostly during clinical trials, later on during the long-term follow-up, post-marketing surveillance, and the so-called real-life data. If you involve caregivers, patients at the very last minute, so probably quite shortly before review, there is so much you can do about the data. The data has been already produced and it's presented. What if that is not really meaningful? What if you actually miss out what's really important to patients, to caregivers, and then finally also to regulators and HTA bodies? If you start early, you can get much more and much meaningful clinical data. That green area, so to say, is a lost opportunity when starting late. And we can't emphasize enough that involving caregivers at the earliest time possible is important to shape your clinical development plan. So let me summarize why this is so important. First of all, it's a capital efficient approach for rare disease programs. It goes without saying, if you have started a clinical development program and it turns out that it's missing out what it's expected by regulators and HTA bodies, you have wasted not only time, but a lot of money. And by the way, also patients and caregivers waiting for the medicinal product. They are in need of it. You have something precious in your hand, but you can't actually play those cards. It helps also to stronger differentiate in a competitive or an emerging indication. It reduces risk of late-stage misalignment, which is again set for failure and very costly. It better informs development investment decisions. So basically, it's evidence grounded in what matters to patients. And with that, I hand over to Charlene to wrap up this set of presentations.
Thank you. So today we have, and before I actually start, I should say, I know there have been some questions in the chat. In a couple minutes, we'll open it up to questions. So if you have additional questions, this is a great time to enter those in the chat. So today we've covered how RareX data, together with human-led expert patient engagement, really enables the development of the caregiver insights that can accelerate and improve therapy development as well as access discussions. And we're very excited about the complementary capabilities that this partnership brings to both rare and ultra rare communities and indications, as well as the global reach that admedicum really brings. And then if you go to the next slide, this is just our summary slide of our capabilities. And so you can really see how there's a complementarity here in terms of what we are bringing to this partnership. Global Genes with our RareX data platform that's deployed in partnership with patient advocacy groups, standard surveys, and cross-disorder scalability. And then admedicum's expertise in patient engagement, insight generation, and in engagements in terms of advisory boards, burden of illness studies, disease characterization, et cetera. And we're really united in this, deep experience in terms of collaborating with patients and families. So I think that that's our last slide. And so now I would like to open it up to questions. I know we have a few in the chat. I wanted to start actually with one, and I'm going to direct this to Andreas. So, you had that life cycle slide and this point around generating these insights earlier in the process. For a lot of organizations, that's actually a change management exercise because they're not doing that today. And so, what advice do you have? What recommendation do you have for people who feel this is important to gain buy-in in their organization to move these types of caregiver insights earlier into the process?
Yeah, thanks very much, Charlene. That's an excellent question because indeed, in many organizations, we have still the policy to look what worked in the past, what just met the regulatory threshold, and then to invest based on that insight. The problem with, I mean, I understand it from a business point of view because they can say, well, this is that there is precedence that this worked, and so why shouldn't we just repeat that? Unfortunately, that's missing out an important bit of insight. That's the insight that is brought in by caregivers at the right time, and if they do this, they may fail. And unfortunately, we have seen that with a couple of clients who came to us, unfortunately, at a very late stage, or when they had to redo the parts of their clinical program. So, and indeed, in many organizations, there are people around saying, well, we need to start earlier. We need to build up the capability to involve patients and caregiver insights earlier in development. And they may have a hard time to convince the senior management to do that. Well, we can unfortunately provide a couple of case studies that show that this is not that this is actually a very costly way to develop if you involve later. We recommend really to think things through, to present case studies that have been shown how much value can be created by early involvement, and unfortunately also those that show the opposite. That's my recommendation.
Mhm. Yeah, well, thank you for kind of highlighting this opportunity to take lessons learned, from previous situations and the invitation for people to reach out on those types of case studies with lessons learned from previous therapy development processes. So I'm going to ask a question to Carmen. Um, and this is a question around data collection. What if a biotech has beat you to the punch and now gatekeeps patient data? It's hard to keep asking ultra rare, patient communities to contribute data. So how can this type of approach that we're bringing forward with RareX really address this challenge?
Yeah, this is a really common problem. It's actually a big part of why RareX got started, is that in rare disease, in rare diseases broadly, it's really common for data to have been collected somewhere, and for that data to really be locked up and not available. So we are working on some of that. That's obviously not like the focus of our conversation today. I would say that that's something that we're definitely working on with a number of groups, to look at ways to collaborate with some of those institutions and companies to pull data into a central place, something like CPATH in the United States. But I think it's also critical to remember that a lot of those studies that have been done are complementary but not exhaustive of what we're really focusing on here. And so a lot of times with rare disease patient groups, we'll really focus on what hasn't been fully captured before. So this patient experience data that has not been done before exhaustively, how do we do that in a way that lowers the burden of participation, that really welcomes all kinds of families to participate, meaning globally without the need to travel, and then make that data available really widely to share. So part of it is just changing the future trajectory while we work on the retrospective problem. And I do hear you in the question that was asked. It is hard to keep coming back and asking these ultra rare disease communities for more, but I think when it's complementary, and you're really asking people to explain, like, how is this impacting your lives? And we need to understand that to make sure that any future clinical trials and studies are designed in such a way that if there's a meaningful therapy, it's actually going to address what's important to you. I think we have found that most families are really happy that we're asking those questions and happy to give that data.
Thank you. Andreas, this is a question around the question is are there tools besides EPROs that caregivers and patients with rare disease want to use? And maybe I'll broaden the question a little bit around, there was some discussion around quantitative and qualitative methods. So, what are the ways that data can be collected and, also make that uh, easy for caregivers and patients?
Absolutely, and also feasible in a clinical trial. That's also important. Of course, e-pros play an important role, can make providing pros easier than in the traditional way of doing that. It helps also, can also be easily incorporated in remote settings. And by the way, not every remote setting is something that is valued by patients sometimes and caregivers. Sometimes they really want to make sure that there are still on-site visits for many reasons, including also safety, of course. But the question was, of course, is there anything beside? And yes, there is, because ePros can capture so much. I mean, it's a structured instrument, of course, or they are covering structured instruments, which are important for quantitative data. But how to obtain qualitative insights in a clinical trial. And here, increasingly in trial interviews, so interviews that are done with the caregivers or the patients, if they're able to provide that to be in that interview, of course, in adult trials, but in-trial interviews are built in the protocol and are undertaken by a interviewer that is not part of the clinical team. That's important because if it's part of the clinical team, caregivers may provide answers that they think they are socially accepted or expected. And here, the well structured semi-structured qualitative interview in trial, which can then be analyzed also and provided into and fed into the clinical data set, you add an additional value. Another option, by the way, is also digital ethnography. The video ethnography is something very used or was used or is being used quite a bit in qualitative studies. It's very difficult, however, to do that in a clinical trial in a larger population due to cost and also to organizational logistical issues. There are tools now available that help patients or caregivers really to depict, to videotape in certain situations, and then they are analyzed automatically after a certain period of time.
Thank you. So I think we only have time for one or two questions, and I know we have a number of questions that we won't be able to get to today, but we're really looking forward to engaging with y'all after this webinar. Andreas, a question for you on regulatory. Does the EMA have guidance that is similar to the FDA's patient-focused drug development guidance? And if not, with the EMA and other regulatory guidelines, how do you suggest using these to define relevant patient or caregiver
Yeah.
clinical outcome assessments?
Yeah, I think that's a question that is asked quite commonly because the PFDD series by the FDA is really a great example of how to do it right. I have to say, to all fairness, EMA does not have a direct equivalent, but it has issued a series of guidances and also a reflection paper on patient experience data. And taken that all together, you can use this. The reflection paper on patient experience data has been released in, I think, November last year. And there was a public consultation period, and this is finished now. You can use that draft already. There are a couple of guidances available, and certainly also the ICH E8 revision 1 asks for early involvement of patients and caregivers, which gives also great guidance to that. So if you want to have a hierarchy of patient-related outcome measures, you should start, of course, with PROs, patient-reported outcome measures, then clinical outcome measures, observer-reported outcome measures, and performance outcome measures that are more traditionally. So most important are the patient-reported outcome measures and the patient experience data. And if you want to have more details, please refer to that paper by EMA. So in a nutshell, it's a bit more complicated, like Europe is. Europe is a bit more complicated than the United States, probably in some ways, but there is guidance available.
That's wonderful. Thank you. And we have one more minute. And so because you said Europe is more complicated, I'm going to expand it because there's a question from about Africa. And I'm going to ask Carmen to quickly comment on this. Just to summarize, there is, African organizations and disease communities in Africa often feel excluded from global case studies and research groups. What concrete steps can be taken, for researchers to partner with African foundations to ensure unique insights these unique insights are represented in rare disease registries? And maybe you want to comment on how we facilitate that within RareX, and then.
Absolutely. Yeah. So Global Genes is a nonprofit organization. Any patient advocacy organization can come and begin to collect data together in partnership with their community on the RareX platform. So, there are programs that we do, like the burden of illness studies that we do with some sponsorship support for sure. But the base model, so what I showed with the FOXP1 community is very representative of a patient community that just joined the platform and really started to engage their community to begin collecting this data and these insights directly from caregivers on the platform. That is something that we collaborate with patient advocacy groups globally on all the time. So we would be delighted to talk offline about how to do that.
Great. Well, thank you both. Thanks for all the engagement and the questions. We're going to go ahead and close the webinar here, and please get in touch with additional questions and follow up. Thank you all so much. Have a wonderful day and a wonderful evening.